All right, guys, so today we are discussing the critical period, which is the time after the Revolutionary War into the time that our Constitution will be written and then ratified and adopted as the living governing document of our country. That was Mr. Cook, you can hear him in the hallway. So it's called the critical period, oftentimes because it is critical to the future of the United States. Essentially, without this time period, without the Articles of Confederation leading into the Constitution, a lot of our establishments in our government would not exist due to them not happening or the things that caused them not happening under the Articles of Confederation. Also, it was quite critical that we as a nation established ourselves as a country independent and sovereign with a government that is effective, and that didn't really happen the first time, and we're going to learn about why today. So in the 1780s, essentially, America is going to suffer a mini depression, an economic depression, huge national and state debts. So the national government as well as states themselves borrowed money from individuals, from citizens, from merchants, and from other countries to pay for the militia and the military for the Revolutionary War. We're going to see excessive use of credit to purchase consumer goods as well after the war because of massive inflation. So the dollar, whatever currency they were using, the dollar is has deflated in value, meaning that the dollar's worth less and prices go up. You have to have more of them to pay for things. And so this is going to cause people to start using credit to buy things. We're going to see a lack of unified currency. States will have different currency. The Continental Congress will have a currency. And that's going to lead to farmers, which is the majority of the population, demanding laws to help their sad plight. Essentially, they are going to start losing their farms. Their money is worthless. The value of their crops has gone down. And we're going to see a lot of foreclosures on mortgages for farmers. And sometimes they react violently, as we've seen in the past. Runaway inflation is super ruinous to many citizens. And one thing that the British will do is try and flood American ports with British goods, selling them at lower prices so that Americans don't buy their own goods and boost their own economy as sort of like a last-second revenge against America for getting her independence. We also remember that during the Revolutionary War, a lot of patriots seized loyalist landholdings, their property, and their estates. And that was kind of significant in boosting the colonial economy and helping pay for the Revolutionary War. Many estates were confiscated and then, when not given back, cut up into small pieces of land that people could buy. But some profiteers will start buying up large swaths of those land, so it won't be as beneficial as it probably could have been. Also, under the Treaty of Paris, the Americans were supposed to return confiscated loyalist property to the loyalists themselves, but we're going to see that that doesn't happen, and that's going to cause a point of contention between America and Great Britain that will eventually lead to the War of 1812, which some people call the Second War for Revolution. When dealing with other nations, America is now its own sovereign nation, and so they're going to have to deal with their own foreign policy issues. With Great Britain, since they just kicked Great Britain's butts, it's going to be rough ground. Essentially, Great Britain is going to refuse to make commercial treaties, is going to refuse to repeal the navigation laws ancient from the 1650s, even though America doesn't really listen to them anymore. And what they're really going to do is try and remain active in the far reaches of the American frontier, probably to maintain alliances with the natives in an attempt to kind of stick it to the United States, supplying the natives with weapons, form a barrier of between America and Canada, which Great Britain still rules at this point. And they're also rightfully going to accuse that the United States broke the pledge to pay back their debts as well as return loyalist landholdings, which they rightfully accused America of doing that. With Spain, remember, Spain has lost a lot of their land holdings before the Revolution, as did the French, and now America has control of all of, anywhere from Michigan all the way down to Louisiana, except for Florida. America does not have control of Florida. And Spain, essentially, while they do have landholdings still in the Mississippi River, are going to try and close the mouth of the Mississippi River around New Orleans in 1784. This really hurts farmers that are farming on the frontier in Tennessee and Kentucky that are becoming more and more developed, who use New Orleans as a port to sell their goods to other countries in the Gulf of Mexico. Now those farmers might have to ship their goods over the Appalachian Mountains, which is increasingly expensive to do so. They're also going to conspire with natives in order to try and take more parts of the Gulf of Mexico and crawl up into U.S. territory in the south. And essentially, what they're trying to do is regain territory, thinking that America is weak as a nation, which it is. France is going to do a similar thing in New Orleans, but mostly what France is angry about foreign policy-wise with America is that they had loaned America a lot of money, and not just money, but troops and supplies for the war, and now would like those debts to be repaid. Well, in the 1780s economy of America, they're experiencing an economic depression and cannot repay those debts. And so what France does is restrict U.S. trade with the French West Indies and other French ports until they're paid, which is a massive hurdle that the American economy has to get over, because a lot of their trade is done in the French Caribbean, especially their trade of rum and molasses. And those rum and molasses goods in America are what are traded in the French West Indies for slaves. So the Southern economy is going to really experience limitations when France cuts off American trade with the French West Indies. And lastly, something that is not typically in your history books, but is an extremely interesting time period, is America's foreign policy in the Mediterranean with North African pirates called the Barbary Pirates. So America does have a thriving Mediterranean commerce, but essentially it's being ravaged by pirates from Algiers, Tripoli, and Morocco on the North African coasts. So essentially, Great Britain all these years had been paying off these pirates under the table to just leave British and American ships alone. Well, now Americans no longer have that protection, that bribe money, essentially, and they're going to see a lot of their sailors and their stuff taken, held for ransom, enslaved, sold by these Barbary pirates, because that protection, that bribe money is not there anymore. And actually, this is an issue that Thomas Jefferson, our third president, is going to have to deal with later on. So the Second Continental Congress essentially is weak during the Revolutionary War. Their only job is to control the military affairs and foreign policy, and not even really foreign policy. It's more just like seeking foreign aid during the Revolutionary War. They had no constitutional authority. States all thought of themselves as sovereign, like mini baby countries. And so essentially America goes through a period during the Revolutionary War where they don't have a government. They just have the Continental Congress, and it's just taking care of war stuff. The Articles of Confederation were written and adopted in 1777, 2 years after the war began at Lexington and Concord, but not actually ratified and put into effect until 1781, and that's less than 8 months before the end of the Revolutionary War. So during the entire Revolutionary War, America's just kind of flying by the seat of its pants, trying to get through the war without a government. All states had to approve the articles to be adopted as the government of the United States, and that took a long time because a lot of these states with large tracts of land going out west, like New York and Virginia — Kentucky was part of Virginia at this time — are holding out until they are promised rights that they think they deserve because they have large swaths of land and thus more people moving into those areas. So under the Articles of Confederation, essentially 13 states come together only when there's a common problem, like foreign affairs. It is a confederation, so little states that think that they're all sovereign coming together every once in a while. The federal government has very, very little power. Congress is supposed to be the chief agency of the government, but there's no executive branch. And that's because they were very fearful of tyrannical rule, the monarchy that they just left. So they just completely left an executive branch out. There's no judicial branch. The court system and interpreting laws was left up to the states. Each state had a single vote in Congress, and that means that smaller states could easily get more power than they rightfully deserve because they have less people than the larger states like Virginia or New York. Bills needed a 2/3 supermajority to pass. That's 9 out of 13 states to pass a law in the federal government, and 13 out of 13 states to amend the Articles, and that's why it never actually happened. So the Articles of Confederation were extremely weak and ineffective, and each state thought itself to be sovereign, and that's going to cause issues between the states and with the federal government. So a lot of these weaknesses come out of the Articles of Confederation. Two of the most crippling weaknesses are the fact that they can't regulate trade and commerce between the states, and they can't regulate commerce within like the United States trade with other countries. So different states are going to be making deals with different countries and not as a unified front as the United States of America. The federal government won't have the power to collect taxes as well. And this is especially crippling because a government cannot do anything without money and then must borrow money from states who have the power to tax their individuals. They couldn't act directly upon individual citizens within a sovereign state if there was an issue. Instead, the state had jurisdiction over those issues. They couldn't regulate currency, so many different states had their own currency, and it was difficult to travel between states. It was difficult to trade between states, and that's going to cause a lot of issues and fights between states that the federal government has no power to mediate or mitigate, okay? Because they have no money, they have no way to raise a continental army or a navy. And so we're going to see rebellions crop up, and states are going to have to pull together volunteer militias because there's no money to create an army or navy to stop these things from happening. It's not all bad for the Articles of Confederation. In this next part, we're going to talk about how they regulate the Northwest Territory, and this is probably the only good thing that happened under the Articles of Confederation. When I say the Northwest Territory, refer back to this map. It is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and parts of Wisconsin is what belongs, what they called the Old Northwest. Northwest because this is where they live, so technically that is northwest of them. Today, with our current map, it's not northwest. That's what it was to them. So two laws that were pretty good under the Articles of Confederation, the Land Ordinance of 1785 and then the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is like an upgrade of the Land Ordinance. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 decided that this acreage of the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, are going to be sold by the federal government, and then that money is going to go towards paying back Revolutionary War debts. It should be split into townships, 6 miles wide, 36 sections of a square mile, essentially. So very boxy towns, and there needs to be a section for a school within each. So it's a very systematic way of setting up a territory. So once they become territories, then we get the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is regulation. It's like an upgrade of how do they become states. Here's how it is. You have to have 60,000 inhabitants, and once that happens, inhabitants, I said that wrong, inhabitants, once that happens, then it's no longer a territory, it becomes a state, they can send a delegate to Congress, and they're on equal status with other states. And the significance of this is essentially by not subordinating states and saying, oh, this is a territory, it has the same power as you, we're going to see more peace between the East and the West. Essentially, it worked in Michigan and Wisconsin. But in places like Ohio, it was kind of already, people had already gone out to Ohio and grabbed land, just like Kentucky. Kentucky had a very tumultuous beginning on the frontier. And so I'm going to show you a map here, right here. This is what Lawrenceburg looked like. As you can see, there's not a lot of like perfect squares. It's not boxy. We don't have 1 mile square and half-mile square blocks. Lawrenceburg and other Kentucky towns were established in people just grabbing land, essentially. Frontiersmen, kind of like pioneers like Daniel Boone, coming out here and establishing an area and saying, this area is mine. Whereas where my husband is from, he's from New London, Wisconsin, you can see the vast difference. New London, Wisconsin was set up under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and Wisconsin became a state under it. And you can see that everything is a perfect little box, a half-mile wide. And that is because there was a systematic approach to colonizing that area with the Northwest Ordinance. Whereas in Kentucky, like Lawrenceburg, there was absolutely no systematic approach whatsoever. And that's why towns here in the South are much more windy and we have weird roads. And in Wisconsin and Michigan and parts of Illinois and Indiana, they're much more boxy and organized because of the way they were established. So like I said previously, the land ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance are kind of one of the only benefits that comes from the Articles of Confederation, the only good thing the government is able to get done during this time period. Mostly it's failures of the Articles of Confederation, primarily the accruing of debt. One second. So you need to remember, during the Revolutionary War, the nation of the United States, as well as the states, had borrowed money in order to finance the war. And when you borrow money, it's not just money you're borrowing, it is also the interest accruing on that money that will just add to the amount of money that you owe. One of the issues, because the federal government has no power to mitigate issues between states as well as to control commerce, states are going to start fighting over trade as well as boundary issues. Many states like Virginia, like South Carolina, like New York and Pennsylvania are trying to grab land out on the western frontier past the Appalachian Mountains and start fighting over whose land is whose. But the federal government has no power under the Articles to fix that. With commerce issues, we're going to see a tariff on goods passed between states. A tariff is a tax on imports, and usually it's when a good is brought into the country, the federal government taxes it. States are going to start taxing other state goods to encourage commerce within their own state, but that hurts us as a unified nation. And of course, we have almost all states who are in debt start printing more money, and that deflates the value of the money itself and causes inflation. Let me click through these real quick. We went over these in class. All right, so this all comes to a point in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion. In Shays' Rebellion, we see western Massachusetts backcountry farmers losing their farms because they're in debt. Their crop prices are going down, the value of their dollars going down, but the prices of other things are more expensive. And so they're unable to pay their debts, they're unable to pay their taxes, and they can't pay their mortgages, which means the bank is going to come and foreclose on their farms and their houses. So we see many of these men had fought in the Revolutionary War and are now thinking, this is the country that I fought for. Captain Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War vet, he gathers a bunch of people. They petition the Massachusetts legislature for cheap paper money, lighter taxes, suspension of mortgage foreclosures, in hopes that that would stop the issue from occurring. That doesn't happen, and so that same year he organizes 1,200 farmers to march on several cities, close down the courts, the debtors' courts in those cities, so that the mortgage foreclosures and the trials for debtors cannot go through. And actually, they're on their way to Springfield, where the Massachusetts Supreme Court is, and where the Massachusetts Arsenal is as well. And on the way there, essentially, a volunteer militia is raised by wealthy New Englanders. So wealthy people in Massachusetts and surrounding states know what's going on, that there's a riot of 1,200 farmers led by Daniel Shays coming for the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And they will fund a militia that will scatter Shays' Rebellion, and Daniel Shays will be put on trial, but later pardoned. The issue here is, isn't that the federal government's job to put down rebellions like this, to protect the states, to protect the farmers who are having issues? Yes, the answer is yes, but the federal government was so weak that they had no power to do that. So this truly shows the weaknesses of the federal government. The significance of Shays' Rebellion is that many propertied elite will now think that the Articles of Confederation has set up a mobocracy. A type of government is not actually a type of government. It's slang for a type of government where the people can truly rule, and in their opinion, the elite think that the poor and uneducated shouldn't have that power. So the states, being their own sovereign states, essentially allows the poorer people to have more of a voice within their state and cause more problems. Whereas if we had a strong federal government, these rebellions could be put down pretty easily. So that same year, right after Shays' Rebellion, oh, and let me add here that this clash of poor farmers getting angry at governments for not protecting them, this is not a new thing. Remember Bacon's Rebellion, Leisler's Rebellion, Paxton Boys, Carolina Regulator Movement. All of this happened before we were a separate United States, and people thought that having a separate United States and home rule and representative democracy would stop that from happening. And they realized that no, these problems are still going to continue if we don't have a strong national government. So the Annapolis Convention, the principal purpose of it is to settle the trade issues between states, the tariffs, the currency issue, trade policies, fighting between states. But when they come together, they realize that, number one, only 5 states showed up because the states see themselves as so sovereign as important that they don't truly need to listen to what the federal government wants. They don't need to make any changes. And so that idea in itself is angering those that want to change the Articles of Confederation. So essentially, Alexander Hamilton will, at the Annapolis Convention, gain a commitment to call upon Congress the next summer in Philadelphia. And that is where we're going to get our Philadelphia Convention or Constitutional Congress or Constitutional Convention that will end up trying to amend the Articles, but ending up kind of just scrapping them because they're so ineffective. So every state is going to send participants except Rhode Island, and the leaders at the delegates, 55 of them, will be appointed by their state legislatures to go. And these delegates will come in 1787 to the Philadelphia State House and meet in secret. They don't want to incite rebellion against them. They don't want their cause to be known. They didn't want to advertise that they were dissenting or give fuel to the opposition or make the states who are enjoying being their own little like baby countries and sovereign states any reason to distrust them. So these men are mostly rich, prestigious, elite, and conservative. And when I say conservative, I don't mean it in the sense of our conservative parties today, but more like they are wealthier and they believe that the wealthy should rule. And they're not so much wanting to radically change things. So think of conservatism as the antithesis to radicalism at this time. Washington is made chairman of the convention. He's to preside over it and solve any issues in it. And we have a lot of important people like Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. Thomas Jefferson will show up towards the very end after it's all kind of over. James Madison is who we consider to be the father of the Constitution. And he's seen to be the father of the Constitution not because of it's kind of like a misnomer. Other people contributed heavily to the ideas of the Constitution, but the 3 principles that just seem innate in America kind of came from him. The first one is national principle, the idea that the national government should be stronger than the states. And James Madison was kind of a radical in this way. He was hoping that the states would be more administrative and not even really governing, but the delegates who are conservative and don't want super radical change would have never agreed to that. But his belief behind national principle that the federal government should have more power than the states is that the government gets its power from consenting individuals, not from consenting states. And so the states would be more administrative and intermediary between the people and the national government. The next idea he brought to the table was the separation of powers. So not exactly 3 branches of government until they write that into the Constitution, but the idea that different independent bodies of government are not affecting each other, but can come together and solve issues and common problems, and they each have specific powers in order to solve issues. So we're going to turn that into the 3 branches of government, executive, judicial, and legislative, when the actual writing of the Constitution happens. And finally, the idea of an extended republic, and that's the idea of controlling factions and limiting the negative impact of individuals in the government, and that's through representation voted in by the people. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation are scrapped. That goes against what the Articles of Confederation Congress really wanted. They just wanted them revised. But remember, it takes a 13 out of 13 vote, a unanimous decision to revise the Articles. So this Philadelphia Convention, where they came together to try and change things, they soon quickly realized that that's not what's going to be what happens. Essentially, if you think about the Revolution overthrew a government that they didn't like, which was British Parliament and the monarchy of the king. And then they wrote the Articles of Confederation, and then over a period of a few months, they overthrow the Articles of Confederation and create the Constitution, which is what we're still living under today. And so you could look at the changing of the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution as a mini revolution in itself, albeit a bloodless revolution, a peacefully overthrown government in the span of a few months, which is pretty much unheard of. Also one of the reasons we call this the critical period. Now, states feel very in danger of losing their sovereignty and that taste that they've gotten of being kind of like their own little baby countries, and that's going to be an issue going into the framing of the Constitution. One of the largest issues of the Constitution was the way that people would be represented in Congress. They already had a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, but now the Congress is going to be more responsive to the people and also more powerful. So the delegates really took care to make it as serving to the people as possible. So two different plans are put forth when it comes to representation in Congress. The large state plan or the Virginia plan put forth by James Madison. Essentially, this is the idea of a bicameral legislature and three branches beyond that. But within the legislature, both houses would be represented with proportional representation. So the amount of people in your state is put into a math equation that figures out how many representatives you're going to get in Congress and thus how many votes you're going to get in Congress in both houses. And in that one, big states have the power. On the right, we have the New Jersey plan that William Patterson put forth. This is sometimes called the small state plan. And essentially, the small state plan is very much like the Articles of Confederation Congress, which you would think, well, why haven't they learned from this? The fear of the small states is that they're going to be bullied by the large states, that they're going to be told what to do, that they're going to be outvoted. And so they wanted a unicameral legislature, just like the Articles of Congress, with each state getting an equal amount of votes, just like the Articles of Confederation. It also, however, to make it a little bit different, they gave Congress a few more powers that Congress is allowed to vote on. So in the middle here, we have the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, put forth by Roger Sherman. Essentially, what it is a bicameral legislature. Bicameral means two houses. The upper house would be the Senate, and representatives are equal from each state. So, for example, we have 2 representatives from Kentucky, Virginia has 2 representatives, California has 2 representatives. So there are 50 representatives, senators in the Senate, and they serve for 6 years. In the House of Representatives, we have representatives based on population. Currently, there are 435 representatives serving, and the number of people you have in your state determines how many representatives you get based on census data. But one of the big compromises here was the Virginians and big states didn't want to get outvoted by small states. And so they put into the Constitution that revenue bills would originate in the House. And here's why. Big states have a larger burden of taxation. They have more citizens and thus must pay more taxes. So the idea was they should have more of a say. With the Great Compromise, honestly, large states benefited more because they get the say on taxes, which are very near and dear to Americans' hearts. And they get more representation in a House that's supposed to be more representative of the American people, the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is more of a revolving door. Senators are elected or up for election every 2 years. And so big states really did win this game. So in class, we went over through a series of stations, 8 different stations about compromises that were made in the Constitution. and things that were put into place that are kind of still in effect today. So you don't have a section on this in your notes because we did those station activities, but if you didn't explain them, this is a good resource. For the next few minutes, I'm going to explain them really, really briefly to you guys. Again, I am not trying to teach you government right now. I'm just trying to lay down what they put in the Constitution and why, essentially, in a very, very brief manner. So one of the first compromises was a strong, independent executive branch. Again, many people are fearful of tyranny or of a monarchy or of someone taking over way too much power like they had in Great Britain. A domination of sorts in government. And so most state constitutions at this time had very weak governors, and putting in a strong executive branch was a big step for many of these delegates. The presidential powers include military commander-in-chief, powers to appoint domestic judges, as well as Supreme Court judges, and a veto of legislation, which frightened a lot of conservative delegates. The next compromise would be the Electoral College, and the need for the Electoral College sprang from this elitist idea that you could argue is still pertinent today, that the uneducated and poor shouldn't have the right to choose who the president is, because they are uneducated. They don't know what the country needs. And that was the argument for the Electoral College. Essentially, it is used to elect the president rather than a direct vote. Electors would be chosen by their states and who would then cast their votes. It's a little bit different nowadays than they had originally framed it in the Constitution, but the idea is still the same, that the vast majority of people that are voting are not actually voting for the president. Does your vote count? Yes, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's up to the electors who gets to be president. Also, keep in mind, during this time period, most people are excluded from voting in general. You had to be white, you had to be male, and in many, many states, you had to be a property owner in order to vote. So the idea of the Electoral College even narrows that scope of who gets to decide who is president. That's a conservative safeguard of theirs. Next would be a bunch of compromises about slavery. The North-South issues are going to dominate slavery and commerce compromises. Essentially, the North is going to be forced, their hand is going to be forced to compromise heavily on slavery issues in order to gain more of the things that they want. So the first compromise is the 3/5 compromise. The North argued that slaves should not be counted for representation or census counting since they're not citizens. And the South argued that the smaller population of the South then would lead to the Southern states being bullied in Congress, a Northern domination. The North truly wants to propose abolishing slavery in the country, but that would have ended the convention right then and there. No constitution written, no compromises. So they will end up giving away a lot of their ideas that blacks should be free. So the compromise was that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes in the House. So, for example, if a landowner had 5 slaves, he would only send in that he had 3 of them for census data. The idea here is that Northerners truly believe that slavery is going to die out eventually, but that doesn't mean that they're super abolitionists. I mean, they are, but not because they believe in black rights. Essentially, they also believe that blacks were inferior and that freedmen should only work as menial laborers, not that blacks are on the same level as whites. But they're still going to fight for those rights, not the rights, but fight for the end of slavery and get kicked down a lot by the South when writing the Constitution. The next compromise would be, so the South got to count 3/5 of their slave population for representation. The North wants the slave trade to end in 1808, and that is written into the Constitution. Most states wanted to immediately end the importation of slaves, except for those deep South slaves, deep South states. Essentially, South Carolina and Georgia completely protest this, but they are forced to compromise because they do need that slave labor for rice production, which is a major cash crop. Finally, the last slave compromise is the fugitive slave provision allowed Southerners to cross state lines to reclaim their property, their slaves. So go into the North to find those freed slaves and bring them back to the South for service. So this is just another example of Northerners having to give in to Southern demands because of slavery. Another issue between the North and the South are things that lead to the commerce compromises. Essentially, the South is very agricultural and slave-based economy, whereas the North is more industrial and manufacturing-based economy. So the compromise here is that the Congress decided that the federal government had the power to tax imports, but not to tax exports. And there's a little bit of irony in this, in that the South gave up power to the North because it expected to be dominant anyway, because they thought more people would move down south because of the expanding into the Southwest. The North gave up slavery to the South, gave up a lot of things they wanted ended about slavery to the South because they thought slavery would die out anyway, and both of them are absolutely wrong when it comes to those assumptions. Next compromise here is the idea of checks and balances. The three branches were created. Originally, those were Enlightenment ideas by Montesquieu. The three branches are executive branch, legislative branch, judiciary branch. Executive branch enforces the laws. Legislative branch makes the laws. Executive branch enforces the laws. Judiciary branch interprets the laws, and they have checks on each other. And you've written those down in class. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's quite a bit. Next is the elastic clause. This is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And this is sometimes called the necessary and proper clause. Let me quote it here. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Essentially, nationalists, people that wanted a strong national government, wanted a blanket statement that said the national government has broad powers. We just can't list them all in the Constitution. Along with the line would the Constitution would be way too long. The list would be way too long, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So we need to blanket statement give Congress these powers. States' rights advocates argued against this, but the clause essentially is giving Congress flexibility to meet the social changes, the information changes, the technological changes, the economic changes that have faced our country for years and years. For example, originally the right to marry who you wanted was a state power. States could outlaw or regulate marriage licenses, but recently in 2015, the federal government through, something versus Oberfelder, the gay rights case in the Supreme Court, it's leaving my mind, outlawed that premise that the federal government has the right to regulate who you can marry because states were using that right to discriminate against lesbians and gays. And so that's just an example of the elastic clause, the federal government stretching its power to fit the needs of a changing nation. All right, so Congress gains the right to regulate commerce, both foreign and domestic, and within the Constitution is put the supremacy clause, that the Constitution became the supreme law of the land because they don't want those states' right advocates trying to grab power again. Federal power is always going to supersede state power. Lastly, we have the idea of conservative safeguards, and the purpose of these is to check the excesses of the mob, to stop a mobocracy, to stop the majority of people taking over the government. And the idea of suffrage and democracy was scary because what if the mob chooses things that aren't good for the country? So conservative safeguards are put into place to make sure that the elite and educated are the ones that are in power. Federal judges are appointed for life, appointed by the president. The president is elected indirectly by the Electoral College and not directly by the people who might be uneducated and don't know who they're voting for. Senators originally were chosen by state legislatures, but that's going to change with the 17th Amendment. And the House of Representatives were permitted to choose their officials by direct vote of qualified citizens. So all these examples are just examples of how the elite want the elite to choose who is in power and not those that they deemed unqualified to choose. So while the Constitution is put into place, now it must be ratified, and it's a very shaky ratification process. All delegates felt like they had given way too much up in the compromises. Slavery was written in as a legal institution, which bothered many people, and there was no Bill of Rights. And the reason that there was no Bill of Rights early on is because this fragile consensus existed. It was very shaky. If more things were put forth, the whole thing could collapse like a house of cards. We're going to see the rise of anti-federalists. And anti-federalists are those who don't want the strong national government. They're going to be very difficult to convince to ratify the Constitution. So unlike the Articles of Confederation, which required unanimous ratification, the Constitution just required 9 out of 13 states, so 2/3 of the states to decide that the Constitution will be ratified in order for it to go effect everywhere. So the small states do it really quickly. Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia has a small population, so does Connecticut, because the Great Compromise made them happy that they have equal representation in the Senate. Pennsylvania is the first large state to ratify the Constitution, and then it comes to Massachusetts. And the way that ratification worked was that special elections were held in states for members to go to a convention to ratify the Constitution, decide whether their state wanted to buy in on it. Massachusetts is important because it's where this revolutionary idea all started, and important leaders live there and work there. But Massachusetts has this anti-federalist sentiment of, we need a Bill of Rights, and that's going to lead to the drafting of the Bill of Rights later. Finally, essentially in June 21st, 1788, the Constitution is officially adopted, even though 4 states had not ratified yet. So the 4 states who have to ratify by force and have no choice in the matter is Virginia. Essentially, Virginia is the largest and most populous state and very anti-federalist because under the Articles of Confederation, they were their own little baby country and they were really powerful under it. We have people like Patrick Henry and James Mason who really, really fought for a Bill of Rights to protect the individual liberties and state liberties. In New York, they're the only state to have manhood suffrage, so any white male could vote for those going to the ratifying convention. In New York, we see John J. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison write influential pamphlets called the Federalist Papers. There's 85 of them. The most famous is Federalist 10, and it's just propaganda that says we need to ratify the Constitution, and here's why, and it was extremely effective. In South Carolina and Rhode Island, they're just ruggedly individual, and finally, after a few months, after we have the Constitution for a few months, they finally ratify it, and then Rhode Island was just like, they didn't even attend the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitution wins out. Nationalists will triumph. The state ratification conventions are dominated by people that want to ratify the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation are effectively overthrown by a minority of conservatives. We have most of the states that will ratify within time before it goes into effect, except for South Carolina and Rhode Island. And the issue here is that if they had put a Bill of Rights on originally, it probably would have ratified a lot quicker for those anti-federalists, but they were afraid of like this unshaky piece that they had. Within the Constitution, we have safeguards against mob rule, like the Electoral College, like not direct democracy, but representative democracy. We have economic and political stability. We are going to get this idea of democracy while still not having the uneducated, not elite classes taking over. And checks and balances are going to ease the minds of those that are afraid of one branch of the government, specifically the executive branch, taking over way too much power. And we can really speak to the longevity of the Constitution because here we are in 2018, it's still going strong. Now, granted, there have been changes, there have been tons of amendments, all of which we're going to learn about in this class, but the fact that they put together within the span of a few short months this document that established a government due to the problems they had with 2 previous governments that is still around today, just truly speaks volumes of the thought that they put into the Constitution, that it is still around today. Thanks for listening, guys. If you have any questions about this, we will go over it in class. Just make sure you ask.